Hey, everybody, we are broadcasting live from the Sports Medicine Update, and we are on the Sports Medicine broadcast. I'm Dr. Josh Hillen, University of Houston, the MAT program, and we are here with Ryan Collins, who's a physical therapist, and just talked about managing the squat and looking at rehab through performance. So, Ryan, why don't you tell us a little bit about, for those that weren't able to listen, tell us about rehab through performance. Walk us through what this means.
So a lot of times we'll get athletes who need to get back to what they were doing before. So a lot of times they come in having had experience squatting with whether it's exercise on their own or through their strength camps with their schools. Um, and that's one of the major goals that we want to be able to achieve is their ability to get back to what they were doing before. Mm-hmm. The squat also is a very important exercise as far as strength training and optimizing performance. So what I talked about today was from the beginning of rehab all the way to the very end, using the squat, making sure that we have all the necessary information to program it appropriately will hopefully allow us to optimize their outcomes and get them back to what they're doing before.
So let's go back to the beginning, right? So you talked about utilizing the squat from the beginning, trying to program them to do well. So, like, for instance, let's use my son. My son is 16 years old. He's playing football at Clear Falls High School. I think they're doing a great job down there, and he's really put on a lot of size, right? And so as a father, I'm able to work with him just a little bit using my background, but I really kind of want to be the dad. So as the professional, what is it that you think these student athletes at a young age need to know? What do the parents need to know? What do the coaches need to know? And let's go back even further. When you're doing the squat, how are you using the squat to assess, the corrections that you need to make?
So I would think the first thing the individual needs to know about a squat is they don't have to squat the same way as the next guy in the squat rack next to them. Everybody's variation and you call it articular geometry, right? How they're built is going to determine how well they squat and which squat variation is probably best for them.
So kind of the old school method of when I was growing up, if your butt's not hitting the ground, then you're just not squatting.
Sure, right.
That's not necessarily true. That's not necessarily functional.
No, it's not necessarily functional unless you are in a specific sport like Olympic lifting, where you have to reach a certain depth, or in order for you to complete the lift, you need to get down below that bar to get underneath it. But the way I think most schools are set up, it's going to be more of a powerlifting type approach. So there's in the actual sport itself, there are certain parameters that you must follow. There's certain levels, degrees of motion that you have to go through to get a successful lift. That shouldn't hold true, and it hopefully isn't held true in schools where they put them at the same expectation and standard that those powerlifters are.
So now the question becomes this. What are some takeaway messages that you want people to know from your lecture, right? You did an outstanding lecture. I think it was very informative. I always learn a lot when I'm here. But give me, let's say, 5 things and I want you to tailor it to how can we relate this information back to the parents? How can we relate this information back to the athletes? How can we even relate this information back to the coaches that may not know what you termed the articular geometry the way that you know it?
So I think the first thing you do before you apply load is you determine their optimal technique. So unweighted, unsupported, you see what depth they go through where they can still maintain proper technique. So if their back starting to round, if their knees are starting to go too far forward, if their heels are starting to come up, all those things are going to reduce the load and stress to the proper areas and put it somewhere else. And so I think the first thing coaches should do and athletes should do is just understand where their technique is, where their optimal
what's
positions
an easy way? So, I remember FMS came out on scene, right? And everybody was using FMS. I still think it's a valuable tool, but how do you measure their optimal movements? Do you use something like the FMS squat or
similar? Similarly, as you have the overhead squat, just to kind of see different areas that move. That's kind of the FMS model. But I would say unloaded position, just a body weight squat, right? You should be able to see what depth they go through before other areas of the motion start moving. So if you put load on them, on their back, typical back squat. You don't want that back to be squirreling around. Okay, the more back movement that's occurring, the more stress and strain you're putting on those structures. Ideally, it's going to be a knee dominant, hip dominant type of movement where the back is staying in control and stabilized. So what I would say would be is, getting an idea of what the depth that they go through before you start to see those changes in technique. And then from that point, really nail down their ability to control from the top to the bottom. So a lot of times athletes will come in, they'll be able to control, and then they kind of drop. Or you start to see that weight shift occur where their trunk's leaning forward. And it's at that point where the athlete needs to feel it, but also the coaches at school,
they need to be able to observe it.
See that change and say, stop there. Right? If you can't control anywhere below this point, then there's no sense in loading past that point because you're not getting the adaptation to the area that you want.
Okay, so that's kind of take-home message number one. What's take-home message number two for you?
Technique's going to be more important than load. You can put 225 pounds on your back, but if you squat using your back more than you do your legs, you're not going to get any stronger in your legs. And if you can maintain optimal technique all the way down and up, you're putting the muscles on stress that you want. So your quad, your hip extensors, right? Those muscles are going to get more of the stress. They're also going to adapt more if you continually stress them. So the rules of hypertrophy, right? You stress the muscle, you produce the fatigue, you produce that breakdown. They're going to get bigger. Bigger muscles can produce more force. Also, maintaining that technique over and over and over again. So don't change up a back squat to a front squat to a low bar squat to an overhead squat on your same program. Initially, when they first start, nail down one technique. The better you get at moving, the better your body it is producing that force more efficiently, which is going to allow you to increase your load.
And so are there any exercises that you can recommend? Now we're still on point number two. Any exercises that you can recommend to help these young athletes, even to help college athletes, to help pro athletes? A lot of times people are using one-legged squat. They're using one-legged Romanian deadlifts. Give us some of the tools that you have in your toolbox that will help.
I think if you're earlier on, some of the younger guys should focus primarily, when it sounds silly, focus on body weight. You can get a decent amount of information from just watching them split squat, bilateral squat, or even just a single leg squat, just with body weight, right? Once they can perform a certain depth, if it's an injury, you want to make sure they're symmetrically moving on the right side versus the left side. If it's a bilateral squat, you want to make sure that there's not a weight shift to one side, there's not those variations. And then progressing to like a kettlebell where you're putting it in front, doing goblet squats. Dan John is somebody, if you are interested in researching progressions, Dan John's big kettlebell squat, right? When you hold it up here, it's a goblet squat. You come down, you're going through a full range of motion, which is important down the road. But it also allows you to maintain a good position, an upright position. Progressing to barbells and all the different implements you can put.
And so what's take-home message number three now? Right. So we have the first one, which was making sure that we're assessing. The second one is form.
Right.
What's number three?
Take home number three, I'd say you want to make sure when you're loading, if it's going to be a front squat or it's a back squat, as a practitioner, as a coach, as a strength coach, and as an athlete, if you have pain, right, there are variations that you can still get optimal adaptations from that don't involve the areas of pain. So if you have,
let me stop there. Let's talk about pain, right? Because when I was playing football, my coach would say, pain is just weakness leaving the body.
Sure. There's a difference between an injury and being hurt, right?
So explain that, right? Like at 43 years old, I've got some hip issues and I experience pain. Like I've got some pain right now.
Right.
That doesn't feel right. So what are some key terms that you can tell your athlete or your patient, this is what I'm looking for, not necessarily like my quads are on fire and it hurts.
Sure.
So what is it that you're looking for?
Well, I think first thing is when you're trying to strength train, there isn't a necessity for pain, right? And so if you're at the bottom of your squat, you have knee pain, medial knee pain, if you have back pain, that's not something that has to be there in order for you to perform the exercise. And as the coach, as the athlete, as the dad, having those athletes tell you what they do and then knowing how to adapt that exercise. So if you have, anterior knee pain, I'll see a lot of patellar tendinopathies where guys come back too fast, they start jumping and running and cutting, and they start a season and all of a sudden the front of their knee just blows up. They can't squat, step, climb stairs, kneel because that front part of their knee is killing them. there's variations of that squat
Mm-hmm.
where you can minimize the anterior stress of the knee. About a box squat or a low bar back squat that allows them to still get good adaptation, still practice the pattern of squatting, but minimize that stress in the front of the knee.
Yeah, no, I get checked up about it too.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So now let's go on to what's take home number 4.
I think you don't just have to squat for the purpose of squatting something heavy.
Mm-hmm.
I think you can use variations in the squat, loads, accommodating resistance to produce more power, more speed, and it still has the benefits of doing that.
And so Bob Marley was just looking at me, and I'm thinking as you're talking, and notice my face.
Let me jump in real quick. Ryan, you talked about the toe over the knee is bad in your presentation. And I kind of got lost because I felt like you said the toe over the knee is bad, and then you said we need to get rid of that myth. So can you explain that to me?
So when your knees go over your toes at the same time that your heels come off the ground, right? You're unable to maintain a good base support. And that weight is going to be transferred more forward onto the knee. And deeper knee flexion angles have been shown to stress the patellar tendon and stress the patellofemoral joint. All right. Though every squat variation is going to have a different amount of anterior knee displacement. So if you have a front squat and a goblet squat where there's a lot of anterior knee translation, you can't perform a front squat and a goblet squat without that movement.
Mm-hmm.
And so that doesn't make it a bad exercise. If you go and take
It just means it's not a good exercise for you.
correct, if that's something that causes problems.
Mm-hmm.
So earlier on, let's say in a rehab, or let's say you have a guy who has patellar tendinopathy, and you're trying to get him back on the field. He's midway through the season. He's got some flared up knees, and your coaches say, "Hey, this guy's got to get stronger to get back onto the field." All right, he's taken 3 weeks off. He got the steroids in him. He's feeling better. You need to make sure that he's strong enough to go. If you go right into jumps and sprints and change of direction, just the natural movement pattern that we go through, there's a anterior translation of the knee over the toes. You can't step down a step. You can't get up and down from a chair without excessively stressing other parts of your body without your knees moving forward towards your toes. So it's not a bad movement. But whenever you do it improperly, or if your load is placed so that if the bar is on my back and I'm doing a back squat, but all my weight's on the ball of my foot and my heels are up in the air, I don't have a good weight shift. I don't have those forces distributed equally amongst my lower body. So a lot of that stress is going to go to the front of the knees. Mm-hmm. So the myth of knees over toes is bad for everything is the wrong way to go about it. So our understanding of how to program knees over toes is more important. Knee pain, ACLs early on, right? Guys who have a lot of knee issues, those variations where we minimize that translation is important versus somebody who's going to Olympic lift and catch. You go Google image an Olympic mm-hmm. lifter at the bottom of their clean, right? Their knees are crazy amounts mm-hmm. of there's crazy amounts of anterior knee flexion.
Yeah, because you're trying to reverse that torque to, get back up.
Right, and if the studies show that the deeper the knee flexion angle, right, the safer your ligaments are because you have the wrapping effect where everything's just compacted together. Mm-hmm. It's not like you're going to blow out your ACL just because your knee goes forward, mm-hmm. which has kind of been the myth was that the more knee forward you go, the more torque on the knee. Well, yeah, but you're also hopefully loading the muscles optimally, which then absorb that force that you're putting at the joint. Mm-hmm. I think that's the big myth. So when you saw I don't know if you saw the picture of the girl trying to do a back squat without her knees going forward, she was literally folded in half. I mean, right. So much amounts of crazy amounts of hip flexion and lumbar spine flexion, and you're asking for an accessory injury,
right?
And you're not getting the adaptation of the exercise.
So it's really there. I mean, there are a lot of myths that kind of come along with this. That if you don't have somebody that has the appropriate training, that has the appropriate knowledge base, that can coach people through this, because really weight training, especially at the high school level, I don't know what it's like at Pasadena High School or even at Katy High School, but I can tell you what it was like at my high school. The coach that was overseeing them, and this is back in like 91, 92, but the coach that was overseeing our weightlifting program had his degree in history, right? And just happened to be a coach, and that's who was supervising. And so it was about getting as strong as you can, as fast as you can. And it wasn't necessarily so focused on form, but we're seeing the more we focus on form, the greater gains that we're going to have. And it's really about preventing injury.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's nothing beneficial about being strong standing on the sideline.
Yeah, right. I like that one. I'm going to steal that if you don't mind.
Trademark.
Okay. Yeah, trademark. All right. So what's one more thing that you can give us?
Let's see.
So we talked about assessment of movement.
Yep.
We talked about form. We talked about some of the myths just now, right? Can you give us something about how do we start when we start seeing gains, when you're working with these athletes, when you're trying, all right, what are we looking for? Give us some benchmarks that we're looking for.
Well, so there's a standard that I think has been refuted, and I talked to a couple of different strength coaches, and they're just kind of meh about it. It's the squat 2 times your body weight, you're good, right? Research has shown, and when you break it down, that that benchmark for a back squat in athletes has been shown to be high, to be able to produce higher amounts of force, period.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So if you can meet that standard, that's kind of a good goal. Now, does that mean that if you don't meet it, you're not as strong? I think what it comes down to is depending on the sport, right? If you're a power lifter versus a soccer player, right? Does the soccer player need to just move something really heavy at a slow velocity, or does he need to be able to go across the spectrum of velocities, moving that weight with as much velocity as possible? So a high force, low velocity lift is beneficial for when you come across a point where you have to move something as heavy as possible, right? Versus whenever I'm trying to sprint or jump with just my body weight, hopefully I have the force to move just my body weight at a high velocity. So I think
it goes back to simple understanding of power versus strength.
Sure, and the said principle, right? So if we're going to program the squat into the variations in the spectrum of a sport, looking at the individual and what the sport they play, position they play, a lineman's going to be different than a receiver. You want to make sure that your training is hitting those different velocities. And so a 2 times back squat might be important, but you also need to consider that this guy's also got to be able to move his body weight as quickly as possible. He's got to be able to jump a certain height, right, depending on the sport that they play. And you can't just achieve that by increasing maximum strength. So I would say, based on their position, based on the stresses and velocities they come across more often during their sport and during their activity, that's kind of where your focus should be.
Very good.
Benchmarks would be kind of the sport independent, position independent.
Okay.
All right, I got last thing for you here, Ryan. Look, I think every time we've talked, I've asked you, do you have social media, right? Do you have social media yet? Do you have Twitter? Any of that stuff. Okay.
Wait. Hang on. You don't have social media?
You got Facebook, right?
You have Facebook.
I have Facebook.
But that's personal.
It's pretty much my wife posting pictures of my kids. That's what's on my Facebook.
All right. So as a clinician, how do you feel? Like, do you feel very focused? Because if I'm trying to do Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all that stuff, I'm on social media because it helps the podcast, that kind of thing. But how has that positively impacted you with personal and professional life, not being on social media?
Not being on social media? Oh, man.
Just nothing to do with the hip.
I know, but we're ending, and I always ask him, all right, so Ryan, how can somebody get a hold of you? And his email's in the thing. So we have his email, right? So I always ask him about social media. He's like, oh, I don't have that stuff.
Yeah.
Right. But it's important because like you said, his
do we
wife's
send up,
talking
like,
about
the bat signal, or?
Well, it's one of the ways.
Yeah. I mean, we just saw Wonder Woman last night or yesterday. So I mean, is
I
that
saw Guardians last night.
is it like a
I don't know. I don't know. I guess
like is there
not being
is
on
there
social
like a,
media
is there like a Ryan Collins PT website where you can.
I mean, there's, like I said, his
Well,
email will
I
obviously
think
be
you
there.
can hire Jeremy
I'd love
as a contractor,
Jeremy can do all the work.
and he can.
I'm not that smart.
So
That's
I guess, in my line of practice, I'm a little limited on sharing information based off of the rules of HIPAA. And the patients I see come to me under insurance and probably don't want to be sharing their information out there. So, and I don't know, I guess I My initial thought is I don't have much to share because I don't know if I can share.
But yet you've been on the podcast several times. You've been shared here,
Yeah.
so you do have lots to share.
Well, let's put it this way: I'm not the smartest guy in the room, and so what I like to do is
It's not me.
let the smart guys do all the hard work, and I just share their information with everybody else. So, if I came up with something groundbreaking, maybe I'd go find a website and put it on there. But
This is groundbreaking.
But what I like is, the other guys that do the hard work, and then I'll just say, hey, thanks for that information. Let me kind of compile it, and then hopefully share it with the masses. So I'll be the middleman. Let the guys
In
do the hard work.
research, we call that a meta-analysis.
I
Yeah,
love
yeah.
meta-analysis. This is great.
That's what you're brilliant at.
Oh, good. Well,
So,
good.
I mean, very few people can take all this information and funnel into one source and say, this is how we make use of all this information.
Yeah, but if it's not mine, then I can't really
Well,
post it on my.
sure you can. You can
Instagram.
reference it.
Oh, that's a lot of work. It's a lot of citation.
Oh, now we're back to it. Now we got the answer.
Is Jeremy
So-
going to do that?
No. So I find myself a lot, like Sarah and I have talked about it. I'll be at home and I'll be just looking at Twitter or looking at Facebook or looking at Instagram instead of playing with the kids, and sometimes I get like frustrated with the kids, like, what are you doing? But then if I just stop playing with my phone and play with the kid, then I would know what they were doing. And so I'm just wondering, like, I guess if you never had it and then quit using it, or if you had it and quit using it, you would know a difference. But
I don't know. I guess I have never. I guess I don't know if it's a generation. How old are you?
I'm 36.
How old are you?
I'm 34. So it's not a generation.
I'm 43.
We're all sad now.
I'm good.
I'm
We're all past
43.
our,
Gray
we're all
and
past our
bald.
elite status.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just never got into it. So I would assume though, like I have a lot of patients and friends who are on all of those things that you mentioned. I guess the question I have for you, Jeremy, is if you didn't have this, would you be spending time on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook just for the fact that you just live a normal life as a trainer?
If I didn't have the
You
podcast,
didn't have the podcast to throw out to the masses, and it was just your life. Would you be throwing your life out to the masses?
I was actually completely off of Facebook until like somebody had mentioned me on Facebook, mentioned the podcast on Facebook, and they're like, hey, dude, you need to get on there and talk about it. So then I got on Facebook. Well, now that's where I probably spend more of the time, but I was using Twitter some beforehand. I think I would use it a lot less if I didn't have the podcast to kind of share, promote, and, share other people's information. So I think I would use it a lot
I
less.
think you have a wealth of information to share,
I'm not,
and I think it's a great avenue for you to do it.
well, I enjoy podcasts. I enjoy the update, giving me an opportunity to do this. Sometimes, life only wants to hear so
That's
much
what we
about
call
squatting.
deflecting.
That's right.
It's good.
You can only,
That's what we
you
call
can only talk
deflecting.
too much about the squat to your wife before she turns a deaf ear to you.
I understand.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, since we can't get hold of you on social media, your email?
Ryan.Collins, COLLINS @memorialherman.org. Be the best way to get hold of me.
Very good. Ryan Collins, he's been on the podcast multiple times. So if nothing else, go to sportsmedicinebroadcast.com and just click search and then Ryan Collins and you'll find him. He's also helped out with some of the interviews at the update in the previous years. Ryan, appreciate it, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Ryan. Let's see what you got.